Empires rose, thrones fell, yet their rulers left stories time could never erase. Welcome to a new story. Let us know in the comments where you're joining us from, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Now, let's begin the untold journey of crowns, power, and history. The woman the court feared as a queen was born in the city of Palmyra, sometime around 240 CE, in the sun-bleached corridors of a desert outpost that sat between empires. At the crossroads of Roman influence and Eastern trade, Palmyra was a city of survival and ambition, shaped by caravans and compromise. Its wealth came not from conquest, but from knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. Zenobia, born Julia Aurelia. Zenobia emerged from this soil, a daughter of Palmyrene nobility, possibly descended from local dynasts, possibly from more Romanized lineage. The histories are divided, but what remains clear is that her education and bearing set her apart early. She spoke multiple languages, reportedly including Greek, Aramaic, and Egyptian, and her command of Latin placed her among Rome's cultured elite, though her allegiance would never truly belong to them. Palmyra, officially a Roman client city, lived in the margin of Rome's gaze. It provided soldiers and trade routes, yet held on to its identity with a quiet defiance. Zenobia's youth passed in a world where women were rarely written into political history, but where influence was wielded in private through marriage, wealth, and proximity to power. The elite of Palmyra, tied to mercantile families and tribal leaders, existed in a delicate balance between Rome's protection and its exploitation. As the Roman Empire fractured under military overstretch and political chaos, that balance grew unstable. Zenobia came of age watching governors replaced by force, emperors assassinated in rapid succession, and Roman power diluted by its own ambition when she married Septimius Odaenathus, a Palmyrene nobleman who would rise as Rome's ally against Persia. She entered the shifting world of military authority and regional autonomy. Odaenathus walked a fine line, presenting himself as a Roman loyalist while expanding Palmyra's military power across Mesopotamia. In his shadow, Zenobia learned the language of rule, of diplomacy, of calculated silence. The couple's political union gave her access to the structures of command, even as Rome looked elsewhere. In the provinces, local rulers like Odaenathus acted as buffers against external threats, particularly the rising Sasanian Empire. But beneath the surface, the structures of empire were loosening. Zenobia gave birth to Vabalathus, a son who would later become her political shield. At the time, he was a symbol of continuity, a potential heir to Palmyra's growing sphere. But even as mother and queen, Zenobia remained an anomaly. Few women in the Roman world exercised open political power, and fewer still did so with military consequence. The eastern provinces, more accustomed to queens with visibility, offered her some space. But even there, ambition was dangerous. Rome tolerated client kings. It feared client queens. As she moved deeper into the inner circles of command, Zenobia's reputation began to grow beyond the city walls. Her presence at court, her ability to navigate both Roman etiquette and local politics, made her an object of quiet curiosity. But there were those in the Roman administration who watched with suspicion. In a time of emperors who rose and fell within months, a woman rising steadily in the East posed a question that would not stay silent. Before Zenobia ever raised an army or issued a decree, she had already begun to reframe what was possible from a city carved into the desert. And as Rome struggled to hold itself together, Palmyra looked outward, and Zenobia looked with it. Zenobia's marriage to Septimius Odenathus was not simply a union of household or tribe. It was a strategic alignment within a city already balanced between Eastern identity and Roman oversight. Odenathus, a powerful nobleman of Palmyra, had steadily risen through Rome's ranks by offering military strength against a common threat, the Sasanian Empire. His campaigns, waged in defense of Roman borders and eastern trade routes, earned him the rare distinction of loyalty in a time when many provincial leaders were seizing autonomy. Zenobia entered this world as more than a consort. Though the title of wife offered no formal authority, her position beside Odenathus placed her in proximity to decisions that shaped empires. As he gathered troops and governed provinces, she listened. As he negotiated with Rome and dealt with tribal leaders, she learned the weight of timing, silence, and calculated presence. While Odenathus expanded Palmyrene control into Mesopotamia, defeating Sasanian forces and retaking lost Roman cities, Zenobia watched the vulnerabilities behind Rome's fractured strength. The West was unraveling. Emperors replaced by mutiny, legions stretched across too many borders, and administrative authority declining across the provinces. Odenathus used this instability to consolidate his own power. Rome, desperate for strong allies in the East, rewarded him not with suspicion, but with new honors. He was named Corrector of the East, a Roman title meant to legitimize his expanding role. In effect, he ruled as a king, though not in name. And in the space behind him, Zenobia absorbed the structure of this fragile empire, not as an outsider, but as someone quietly preparing for what might come next. Their son, Vabalathus, was born into a court that now held military authority over vast regions stretching from Palmyra to the edges of the Euphrates. But with growing power came growing threats. In 267 CE, during a campaign along the northern frontier, Odenathus and his eldest son from a previous marriage were assassinated. The motives remain unclear. Possibly a local conspiracy, possibly Roman interference, possibly internal jealousy. The result, however, was unmistakable. The Eastern Command was leaderless. A child, too young to ride a horse into battle, now stood as heir to a warlord's legacy. And standing behind him was Zenobia. In Rome, the crisis barely registered amid the empire's ongoing upheaval. But in Palmyra, Zenobia stepped into the vacuum. She did not declare herself queen outright. She retained the title of regent for her son, preserving the appearance of Roman custom. But the decisions were hers. She appointed generals, secured borders, and oversaw diplomacy. In her son's name, she issued decrees and gathered loyalty from tribal leaders and provincial administrators. The veil of marriage had hidden her ambition. Now, widowhood revealed its structure. Zenobia did not challenge Rome directly. Not yet. She framed her authority as stewardship. But each decision she made, from military movements to coinage symbols, shifted the balance of power further from the empire and closer to her own court. Vabalathus became the figure through which she would rule, but not the force. That belonged to her. And in the corridors of Palmyra, voices began to ask what Rome would do when it finally noticed who now pulled the strings. Zenobia ruled through her son, but no one doubted who held authority in Palmyra. Vabalathus, still a child, was styled with royal titles and presented as the rightful heir to his father's military mantle. Yet it was Zenobia who signed commands, received envoys, and managed the affairs of a state expanding far beyond its original boundaries. She adopted Roman court rituals while preserving Eastern symbols of divine kingship. Her public image was carefully constructed. Regal robes, formal processionals, and coinage that placed her beside her son, equal in stature. This balance of maternal guardianship and political dominance allowed her to move without open defiance, at least for now. The Roman Empire, gripped by internal chaos, offered space for Palmyra's rise. In the span of a few years, the imperial throne had changed hands repeatedly. Plagues, inflation, and border wars drained Roman strength from within. Zenobia understood the value of timing. While emperors in the West fought civil wars and legions mutinied in the provinces, she issued orders to move Palmyrene forces into nearby territories. First, it was parts of Syria, already under Palmyra's influence. Then southern Anatolia, where Roman control had weakened. Eventually, she extended her command to Egypt, securing grain routes vital to the Mediterranean economy. The takeover was swift, militarily efficient, and diplomatically framed as protection rather than rebellion. Her governance model mirrored Roman structure on the surface. She kept the imperial calendar, preserved Roman legal terms, and sent formal notices to the Senate. Yet beneath that facade, Palmyra began functioning as an independent power. Trade routes were redirected to favor her markets. Local administrators answered to her court. Philosophers and scholars were invited to Palmyra to shape a cultural renaissance rooted in Greek, Roman, and Eastern traditions. The city, once a conduit for empires, now acted as a center of rule. Zenobia's advisors included generals, scribes, and local elites from across the Near East. Her ability to unite tribal leaders with Hellenized administrators showed her deliberate strategy. She was not just ruling territory, she was building loyalty. Her army, a hybrid force of Roman-trained officers and desert cavalry, expanded in both size and reach. Diplomacy was handled through embassies that projected courtesy while reinforcing the new balance of power. To Rome, Zenobia insisted she remained loyal. Her son was still named alongside the emperor on some coins. Her letters referenced the empire's unity. But her actions moved steadily in another direction. The Palmyrene Empire, as it would later be called, had no formal declaration of independence. It simply expanded, one fortified city at a time, one treaty at a time, until maps no longer reflected Roman authority east of the Mediterranean. Behind this expansion was a ruler who understood both the strength and fragility of empire. Zenobia advanced not as a conqueror, but as a guardian of her son, her people, and a legacy rooted in the ruins of Roman overreach. Yet with each step westward, the margin for subtlety narrowed, and across the sea, Rome was beginning to notice what had taken shape beneath the desert sun. Within the fortified walls of Palmyra, Zenobia presided over a court unlike any other in the Roman world. It was a place where scrolls and steel shared the same corridors. Greek philosophers debated in shaded gardens, Egyptian scribes copied texts in quiet chambers, and military orders were drafted in the same halls where poetry was recited. Zenobia curated a vision of power that blended intellect with command. Her palace reflected both Roman grandeur and Eastern tradition, projecting authority through ceremonial formality, yet governed with the sharp precision of a campaign map. Scholars were welcomed, not as decoration, but as instruments of legitimacy. Through them, her rule gained the language of reason, heritage, and law. But beneath this surface of cultural sophistication, tensions moved in silence. Phobalathus, still a minor, remained the official sovereign. His face appeared on coins. His name followed imperial titles. But he did not speak before foreign envoys, did not lead council meetings, and did not issue commands without his mother's signature. Zenobia kept him at the center of state imagery, yet carefully insulated him from the unstable mechanics of governance. Her control was absolute, yet always framed in service to her son. This balance preserved the illusion of continuity, a young king being raised in tradition, while allowing her full command over statecraft, diplomacy, and war. Her generals, loyal in name, grew restless in posture. Many had risen under Odaenathus, men shaped by years of military autonomy, now observing as decisions flowed through a single voice behind the throne. Some questioned the pace of expansion, others the wisdom of provoking Rome without open defiance. Yet dissent remained hidden. In public, they obeyed. In private, they hesitated. The question was not whether Zenobia ruled well. She ruled effectively, but whether the structure beneath her could bear the strain of ambition layered upon uncertainty. Inside the city, loyalty was maintained through a mixture of respect, fear, and reward. The merchant elite benefited from new trade routes. Tribal leaders saw their influence rise through proximity to power. Yet not all were secure. As Palmyra's dominion expanded, so too did its dependence on discipline. Surveillance increased, rumors were watched. Decisions once shared across families or councils narrowed into the hands of a few. Palmyra had become an empire in practice, but not in name. And this in-between space left room for suspicion. Zenobia's rule was methodical, but she could not control every whisper. Some advisors questioned the future. If Phobalathus came of age, would she relinquish power? If Rome struck back, would her generals stand beside her or seek survival? And in the silence of those halls, where scholars wrote of Alexander and emperors long dead, there were quiet parallels being drawn. Palmyra stood strong, but strength built in the cracks of another empire did not go unnoticed. The scholars kept writing, the soldiers kept marching, but somewhere between the marble columns and the sand-blown outskirts, loyalty, once firm, had begun to shift in the shadows. In the third year of her regency, Zenobia made a move that reshaped her place in Roman memory. Until then, her power had been expansive but cautious, framed within the language of Roman loyalty, her son styled as a Caesar under imperial approval. But when coins emerged bearing the image of Phobalathus beside her own, both crowned, both titled, the message was unmistakable. She no longer governed as a temporary guardian. She ruled as an equal. By adopting the imperial title of Augusta, Zenobia stepped beyond the limits Rome had historically allowed its client monarchs. The Palmyrene realm was no longer operating in the shadow of empire. It now moved in open parallel to it. Coinage was more than currency. It was a public declaration of power. Throughout the Roman world, these silver and bronze pieces traveled through markets and military outposts, bearing witness to her intentions. Phobalathus was titled Augustus on some issues, an honorific traditionally reserved for the Roman emperor. In Egypt, her name appeared in official documentation, affirming her control of the grain-producing province. What had begun as a regional buffer state now looked, on every map and inscription, like a sovereign empire. To Emperor Aurelian, who had spent the early years of his rule putting down rebellions across the fragmented West, the Eastern situation could no longer be ignored. Aurelian had risen from military ranks during Rome's most unstable decade, a period where emperors were made and unmade by troops within months. He viewed stability not as preference, but as survival. A rival ruler in the East claiming imperial titles and controlling Roman provinces was more than an insult. It was a threat to cohesion, a challenge to the very structure of empire. And so, the emperor turned his focus eastward. Zenobia, aware of the pressure building in Rome, did not yield. She consolidated her hold on Syria, strengthened her grip on Egypt, and reinforced loyalty through political appointments across her territories. The Palmyrene army, though smaller than Rome's, was tested and mobile, with cavalry skilled in desert warfare and battle-hardened commanders who had served under her husband. Still, she understood that Roman response would not come with hesitation. Aurelian was known not for delay, but for decisive strikes. Every mile his legions crossed brought with it the weight of imperial retaliation. In the desert winds of Syria, Zenobia began preparations. Roads were secured, supply lines reinforced, diplomatic routes narrowed. Messages were sent not to surrender, but to organize resistance. Yet even as she maneuvered with discipline, the cost of ambition began to rise. Some governors hesitated in their allegiance. Some commanders shifted their eyes toward Rome. Her decision to declare full sovereignty had brought clarity, but also consequence. The illusion of peaceful coexistence was gone. The empire she built now stood exposed. And in the silence between two powers, sharpened by distance and pride, the desert would soon become the space where empire and ambition met in open conflict. By the year 271 CE, Zenobia stood at the helm of a realm that stretched across three major provinces: Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. From Palmyra, she ruled with the authority of an empress, issuing decrees, organizing defenses, and managing an economy under strain. Her name echoed through military camps and merchant roads alike. In less than 5 years, a desert city had become the seat of a breakaway empire, led by a ruler whose legitimacy rested not on Roman approval, but on her own consolidation of power. Her court shimmered with scholars and diplomats, its architecture blending Roman order with Eastern ornament. But outside the marble colonnades, the weight of expansion pressed heavily on the state's foundation. The vastness of her holdings demanded coordination that stretched Palmyra's resources. Trade routes were longer, borders more vulnerable, and alliances more fragile. The armies that had once moved with speed and precision now required supply chains through hostile or uncertain terrain. Egypt, essential for grain, posed logistical challenges. Anatolia's frontier exposed her to Rome's western march. The rapid success that had brought glory now required constant vigilance to sustain. With each additional province, the line between confident rule and overextension grew thinner. Zenobia responded by centralizing command. She issued orders through trusted officials and required loyalty from local governors who had once enjoyed broader autonomy. Her authority became more direct, her decisions more urgent, but not all in her command structure agreed on the path forward. Some generals, wary of the incoming Roman offensive under Aurelian, pushed for negotiation. Others counseled retreat from Egypt or Asia Minor to consolidate defensible ground. In council meetings and private exchanges, hesitation surfaced. Not yet disloyalty, but a growing awareness that the arc of expansion was nearing its limit. Still, Zenobia projected resolve. Historical records describe her appearance in military dress, not as symbolism, but as signal. She remained present at the front, riding alongside troops as they prepared to defend their positions. For her followers, it reinforced her claim not just to rule, but to lead. For her adversaries, it demonstrated that the Eastern Empire was not ruled by a shadow regency, but by a figure willing to bear risk. This projection of confidence helped sustain morale, even as setbacks mounted. But behind the formality and ceremony, her court sensed a change. Messages from frontier commanders arrived with less certainty. Envoys returned with fewer guarantees. Allies offered silence instead of arms. Palmyra, still radiant in stone and ceremony, had become a city under pressure. The gold that lined its halls could not mask the strain of war. Decisions once made from a position of advantage were now shaped by necessity. And though Zenobia never yielded in speech or appearance, her reliance on personal authority became more pronounced. The same concentration of power that had allowed her rise now narrowed the path ahead. Her empire, carved through strategy and timing, stood exposed, magnificent in scope, but increasingly encircled. And as Roman legions approached from the west, the crown she wore, both literal and symbolic, began to carry not just the weight of rule, but the burden of resistance. In the spring of 272 CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian launched his eastern campaign with precision shaped by experience. He had unified the western provinces through disciplined force and now turned his attention to the Palmyrene Empire. His legions advanced quickly through Anatolia, reclaiming territory without prolonged resistance. City after city opened its gates to Rome, their governors unwilling to sacrifice stability for Zenobia's distant crown. By the time Aurelian reached Syria, the Palmyrene army was already repositioning, preparing to hold the line in unfamiliar terrain. The Battle of Imae, fought near Antioch, would test Zenobia's resolve under direct confrontation. At Imae, the Palmyrene cavalry, long regarded as one of the strongest desert forces in the region, initially pushed Roman troops back. But Aurelian, skilled in deception, drew them into overextension. When the counterattack came, it shattered the rhythm of Zenobia's defenses. Her army retreated toward Emesa, seeking to regroup. There, on more favorable ground, she made another stand. The Battle of Emesa, larger and more desperate, ended in heavy losses for Palmyra. The Roman legions, reinforced and unified under a single command, proved more coordinated than the multi-ethnic units that Zenobia had drawn from across her territories. The tactical brilliance that had once allowed Palmyra to expand now met the grinding force of Rome's imperial machinery. Retreat was no longer just tactical, it became existential. Zenobia withdrew toward Palmyra with the remnants of her army. In her court, once fortified by loyalty and vision, fractures began to appear. One of her generals, previously elevated by her trust, failed to follow orders during the retreat, an act seen not just as hesitation, but as a warning. Another, facing pressure from Roman envoys, abandoned the cause entirely. These cracks were not yet collapse, but they shifted the center of authority away from strength and toward survival. Zenobia still issued commands, her son still presented as ruler, but the confidence that had carried her empire outward now met the pressure of defense. Inside Palmyra, the mood changed. Advisors who once praised her ambition now questioned the path forward. With Roman forces advancing from the west and internal coordination weakening, Zenobia confronted decisions without consensus. Her previous strategy, calculated expansion under the banner of Roman tradition, had given way to improvised resistance. In the corridors of her court, trust became a resource more scarce than silver or grain. Aurelian continued his march. His advance was not slowed by negotiation. He sent messages offering surrender, but prepared his army as though it would not come. To him, the Eastern Empire was not an equal claimant to rule, but a rebellion to be extinguished. His campaign moved with both military urgency and symbolic intent. This was not just about territory. It was about restoring the image of a unified Rome. As Palmyra braced for siege, Zenobia remained visible. She attended councils. She stood beside her son. But those closest to her sensed the toll. The empire she had built, piece by piece, city by city, now stood on the edge of disintegration. And just beyond the horizon, Rome advanced, not with caution, but with certainty. With Roman forces pressing in from the west and Palmyra's defenses unraveling, Zenobia made the only move that remained. The hope of resisting Aurelian's siege from within the city walls had faded. Her alliances had thinned, supplies dwindled, trusted commanders hesitated in council. Knowing that survival now rested beyond the borders of her own creation, she turned her gaze eastward towards the Persians, Rome's historic rivals, whose empire stretched beyond the Euphrates. In the final days of resistance, Zenobia slipped away from Palmyra under cover, moving swiftly with a small escort toward the river that marked the frontier of potential salvation. The strategy was bold but desperate. A negotiated alliance with the Sasanian court might have bought her time, or at least bargaining power. The region had seen shifting allegiances before, and Persia had long sought to weaken Rome's eastern provinces. But Zenobia's timing ran against her. Aurelian's cavalry, experienced in the deserts of Syria, pursued her with relentless speed. Before she could reach Persian-held territory, she was overtaken near the banks of the Euphrates and taken into custody. The arrest was not simply a battlefield failure. It was a political signal. With Zenobia in chains, the Eastern Rebellion had lost its voice. Back in Palmyra, word of her capture spread quickly. Her son, Vabalithus, was seized shortly after. The court that had once held together an empire dissolved in silence. Advisors disappeared. Generals surrendered. Some fled. Palmyra, stripped of its leadership, stood exposed. In a final gesture of defiance, a small faction within the city attempted to rally a second resistance. Aurelian responded without negotiation. The Roman retaliation was brutal and absolute. The city was taken, then punished. Parts of it were burned. Temples, homes, and marketplaces that had once symbolized the wealth of a desert empire now stood blackened, their stones marked by the price of rebellion. Zenobia, now a captive of the emperor she once rivaled, was transported westward. Her image, once minted in silver beside her son's, now passed beneath the watch of Roman guards. In chains, she embodied more than defeat. She represented the dangers of fractured loyalty, the consequences of ambition during a time when empire could not afford challengers. Aurelian prepared to return her to Rome, not as a political prisoner, but as a public symbol. The message was clear. No crown granted outside of Rome's will could stand. Her fate remains debated. Some sources suggest she was executed shortly after capture. Others record that she was spared, brought to Rome in chains during Aurelian's triumph, and later lived out her life in a villa under surveillance. Regardless of which version held truth, the effect was the same. Palmyra's independence was extinguished. Its leader, once seen as the architect of a new Eastern order, now moved only under the shadow of another empire's justice. What had risen from the desert as a challenge to Rome's authority now stood as a caution, carved not in marble, but in ash. In the aftermath of Zenobia's capture, the eastern provinces fell silent. Her empire, built in defiance of Rome's fragmentation, collapsed with her removal. Vabalithus, once presented as heir to a new imperial lineage, vanished from all official records. No inscriptions bore his name again. His fate remains uncertain. Whether he died in Roman custody or was quietly erased by political necessity. The court that had surrounded Zenobia, composed of philosophers, generals, and governors from across the Near East, dissolved into disappearance. Some were executed, others faded into exile or obscurity. The administrative web that had briefly functioned as an independent government was pulled apart thread by thread. Rome restored its control over the eastern trade routes, but it did not rebuild what it had dismantled. Palmyra, once a flourishing hub of commerce and culture, stood hollow. Its wealth, once drawn from caravan routes connecting Persia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean, was stripped by war and Roman reprisal. The grand colonnades still rose under the desert sun, but the rhythm of markets, temples, and councils had been broken. The city was left partially intact, a reminder not of mercy, but of dominance. It no longer held political meaning. Its silence became its legacy. Rome, in restoring its presence, had no use for a Palmyra that claimed agency beyond the empire's will. Zenobia herself became the subject of conflicting accounts. Some Roman sources describe her humiliation, paraded through the streets of Rome in chains of gold during Aurelian's triumph, displayed not as an enemy general, but as a defeated symbol. Other versions, written later, suggest that she was granted a villa and lived out her days in relative peace under house arrest. A third possibility, whispered in fragments, holds that she took her own life during the journey west, refusing to be made into a spectacle. None of these accounts can be confirmed with certainty, and in that uncertainty, her myth grew. Unlike other rebels, her name was not buried. Her rebellion had been crushed, but not erased. Aurelian, in consolidating his empire, understood the importance of legacy. By sparing her memory, he reinforced his own magnanimity. To destroy her would be to acknowledge her threat. By allowing her story to persist under control in fragments, he demonstrated that Rome could absorb defiance without being weakened by it. But her rise remained unmatched. No other woman had led an empire of that scale during Rome's 3rd century crisis. No other challenger from the provinces had seized so much without completely severing ties to Rome. Zenobia's fall ended a chapter in the East, but it also revealed the limits of imperial tolerance and the weight that female power carried within a world shaped by men and militaries. The desert winds moved through the ruins of Palmyra long after her empire fell. Columns still stood. Archways still reached toward the sky. But beneath them, the voice that had once commanded armies and negotiated with kings had been silenced. What remained was not conquest, nor a kingdom, but a trace, carved faintly into history and into stone. Centuries after Palmyra's decline, long after the stones of its temples cracked beneath sand and time, the name Zenobia remained, though her empire had lasted barely half a decade. Its memory endured far longer than its borders. She was not commemorated in triumphal arches or imperial reliefs commissioned by Rome, but in footnotes, echoes, and retellings, written by those who saw in her life something that outlived conquest. Historians in Byzantium recorded her rise with fascination and caution, often through the lens of Roman preservation. Chroniclers debated whether she had defied Rome as an enemy or served it in its moment of deepest fracture. But even among her enemies, her ambition was not dismissed. It was studied. As centuries passed, Zenobia became less a ruler to be judged and more a symbol to be interpreted. In the Arab world, her legacy was tied to the ruins of Palmyra itself, a city of stone that had once stood against empires. In Europe, she was remembered not as a rebel, but as a queen who dared to carve her own space in a world that rarely allowed it. During the Renaissance, when scholars re-examined classical texts, her name surfaced again in Latin manuscripts. A rare figure, both woman and sovereign, who had stood alone in the pages of military and political history. Her brief rule, wedged between the collapse of Roman authority and the rise of imperial consolidation, was not seen as a failure but as an anomaly, a moment when power was briefly worn by someone outside the expected order. In the Enlightenment, writers and philosophers looked to her with admiration. They saw in her intellect and strategy a challenge to inherited hierarchies. The story of a woman who governed through military command, legal reform, and cultural patronage struck a chord with thinkers shaping new ideas of liberty and reason. In France and England, plays and essays reimagined her trial, her speeches, her fall, each bending history to reflect a new age's understanding of resistance. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as women's movements grew across Europe and America, Zenobia was invoked again, not for her victories, but for her refusal to be defined by the limits of her time. Suffragists and writers held her up as an example that ambition and leadership were not confined to men, nor should they be. Yet her story is not one of triumph in the traditional sense. Zenobia lost her empire. Her son disappeared. Her court was scattered. She did not build a dynasty, nor leave behind a stable successor state. But what she did leave behind was something else. The memory of possibility. She had looked at a fractured world and imagined herself not as its caretaker, but as its leader. She stood beside generals and priests, scholars and soldiers, and reshaped a provincial city into the center of imperial strategy. She had issued coins bearing her likeness and held court not in the name of another, but in her own. And when Rome came, she did not retreat into ceremonial titles. She met it with force. The political consequences of her decisions were immediate. Rome reasserted its control. The illusion of regional autonomy faded. But the psychological consequences, the impact of her rule on how power could be imagined, were longer lasting. Zenobia proved that imperial command could flow through a voice outside the Roman Senate, outside patriarchal lineage, outside the familiar architecture of empire. Her vision was not only of rule, but of legitimacy. She claimed it not because she was allowed to, but because she believed she could. Today, among the ruins of Palmyra, battered by time and conflict, her memory remains fragmented but persistent. Statues no longer stand, and inscriptions are weathered, but her name continues, studied debated, admired. Her story has passed through the hands of poets, historians, revolutionaries, and archaeologists. She remains an enigma not because so little is known, but because so much of what she attempted stands alone in history. Zenobia ruled briefly, but the questions her life raised never faded. Was she a savior of the East, or the final mirage of a fractured world clinging to independence? Was she a threat to imperial order, or a necessary voice in an age of collapse? In the end, history did not choose a single verdict. It left behind a name, carved not just in dust and marble, but in the enduring idea that leadership, once seized, does not easily return to silence.